You've been long away. What would you like? Well... visit me.
I wanted to say I hope none of you are getting bored with my current weapon choices here. I just kind of grew into a comfort zone with the axe, and I didn't want to switch it out because it was such a solid damage-dealing weapon. However, at this point when I was playing, I did feel like I wanted to mix things up a little bit in terms of my weapons, so I tried out the Sanctum mace here for a little bit, and then I remembered, oh yeah, it does poison damage every time you swing. So it's a cool looking weapon, and it does a decent amount of damage, but especially since we're approaching a difficult area of Shulva, I didn't want to switch out to a weapon that could potentially harm me as well. I'd only use that type of weapon if I was a little more comfortable with my skills in that area. There are so many possible weapon choices in Dark Souls 2, it's almost overwhelming deciding which weapon you want to use. And I kind of eventually did lean towards more strength build in this playthrough. And as such, I want to use more strength weapons. The only downside is that you get the fat roll, as it's called, if you're over 70% equip rate. This doesn't make the game automatically more difficult, but it does mean you have to be a little more careful in how you time your dodges, because you won't be as agile as you were before. So while I didn't actually end up using the Sanctum mace for this section, I did toy with the idea a little bit, and before this video is over, I will have decided upon a new weapon that I wanted to try out. One that I surprisingly had never used before in this game.
I knew you. Thank you kindly.
These disturbing-looking monsters, which we saw at the end of the last video, are known as the Imperfect. And I have to say they are one of the most mysterious enemies in the entire game of Dark Souls 2, because as far as I can tell, there's absolutely no lore information on these creatures, making them extremely bizarre in this world. And when that's the case in Dark Souls, it's kind of up to us to kind of create our own theories on how these creatures came to be. So for myself, I have two theories. The first one is that these are somehow kind of offshoots of the dragon race, kind of like how the lower torsos of the undead dragons were in the Lost Izalith in the first Dark Souls. They're somehow connected to the dragons because they do share some similar features, but they're still very different. And another interesting thing is they also seem to shoot lightning, which is actually one of the weaknesses of dragons. So this leads me to my second theory, in that they were somehow creations of the people of Sholva. In their worship to Sinh, they tried to emulate his greatness and try to create their own creatures in his image. But of course they didn't turn out very well, and as a result the imperfect were born, because they were imperfect creations of the dragons. So that's my best theory for these creatures, is that they're somehow weird creations of the people of Sholva. They have a very interesting design though, and they're extremely dangerous. As you can see, I did not want to fight them at all. They're more trouble than they're worth, honestly, so I usually just tend to run past them and avoid them at all costs. The dragon stone that we just used to raise the bridge into the central pyramid does have a little bit more info on Sholva. An extremely solid stone, used to operate the Eternal Sanctum contraption. The heirloom of a race that discovered a dragon, worshipped its magnificence, and perished by its side. And that essentially wraps up the history of Sholva into one neat little sentence, is because this entire city, this Sanctum City, this sanctuary, another term for Sanctum, was founded around Sinh. The people discovered Sinh deep below the earth here, and since he was sleeping, he was a peaceful being and one that they worshipped, and as such they built this entire city around him to guard and worship this great dragon. But eventually their worship would come to an end, as is evidenced by all the ruin we've seen throughout the kingdom. But there was also a sole reason this kingdom fell to ruin, and that was because it was a group of knights led by a certain character that brought about the downfall of this kingdom. And I'll go into detail about this group a little bit more once we run into some of their soldiers. These are the Drakeblood Knights, a group of knights who are partially responsible for the downfall of Sholva, for awakening the dragon Sin, and thus bringing destruction to this great kingdom. Their armor set reads, Black armor of the Drakeblood Knights, who came from a land long forgotten. The Drakeblood Knights, who worshipped the blood of dragons, were led by Sir Jorg in a siege of the Eternal Sanctum, but sunk into the sanctum when the slumbering dragon awoke. The red cloth wrapped around their black armor represents the sacred blood of dragons. And so here we almost discover another covenant of sorts in regards to the dragons, but instead of worshipping the dragons, the Drakebloods took pride in slaying dragons and using the dragon blood as a power source almost. And it's in this lore description that we find out one of the key players in the story of Sholva, and that's Sir Jorg, who led the Drakeblood Knights into this ancient kingdom and awoke the slumbering dragon. You may have noticed a couple of times we saw Sin flying about. He had this great spear within him, and that is actually a spear that belonged to Sir Jorg. The lore of the Drakeblood Knights is expanded upon in their greatsword description. Great sword wielded by the Drakeblood Knights, led by the honorable Sir Jorg. The insignia chiseled upon its hilt symbolizes dragon blood. To the Drakeblood Knights, fresh dragon blood was sacrosanct. They believed that by obtaining it, they could achieve a true understanding of life, transcending their own banal existence. And what I find interesting about this is the Dragon Covenant in all three games kind of hints to aspiring to be like the dragons, to be a greater being like the dragons are. But instead of obtaining dragon scales like those other covenants do, the Drakeblood Knights use the blood of dragons. As we can see, this didn't work out so well for them, as very few of them remain, and they're just kind of hiding away here in the remains of Sholva. In fact, I honestly believe that the Drakeblood Knights we do run into are hollow, because they're instantly hostile, and they don't seem to show many characteristics of people who have retained their humanity. They're a neat group of characters, though, and I have to say their armor set is one of my absolute favorites in Dark Souls 2. I just love the way it looks, and that blood red cape they have is just so gosh darn cool. So we'll learn a little bit more about Sir Jorg once we run into Sin again, but between us and the Great Dragon lies another character. One who has ties to this kingdom, and a character who even has ties to the Queen of Dranglake, Nashandra.
You are not deserving of them, Maya.
So we just conquered the first main boss of the Crown of the Sunken King expansion, Elana, the Squalid Queen. Soul of Elana, the Squalid Queen, who rests beside the slumbering dragon of the Eternal Sanctum. This child of dark accompanies the dragon, slowly amassing souls in anticipation of the coming day of vengeance. And the key part of that description there is the child of dark. And this is expanded upon in the description for her boss weapon, the Wrathful Axe. When the abyss dissipated, the things that called it home were fragmented and scattered across the realm. Eventually, these pieces regained form in ways that hinted at humanity's true nature. And in the time of Dark Souls 2, the abyss has dissipated somewhat. That's not to say that it's gone, because you can explore fragments of the abyssal realm in the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant, which are these optional areas that's capped off with a boss fight. So you can explore the abyss to an extent in Dark Souls 2, but it's a little bit different. The important thing here is that there was a being who was tied to humanity and thus tied to the abyss, because in every human being exists a portion of the dark soul. That is what humanity sprung from, was the primeval man obtaining the dark soul and spreading the power of the dark soul to all of mankind. But the pieces of this Lord of the Abyss have now scattered but they were still strong enough to retain some of their form and eventually developed into humans. And so one of these fragments of the Abyss that we have just come into contact with is Elana. So she is a child of the Abyss, a child of the dark, taking on human form and influencing the world of man and gods in her own twisted way. And that's one of the recurring things in the expansions for Dark Souls 2, is we'll keep running into these children of the dark, and all of them try to take on the role of queen, and either influence the king of that land or await the king of that land for various reasons. As for the boss fight itself, I have to say I got incredibly lucky during that fight, because sometimes Elana will summon Velstadt, a boss fight we previously encountered, and that makes the fight a whole lot more difficult because now you have two bosses to worry about, not just one. But I got a bit lucky, and she only summoned the skeletons, which aren't too much trouble to deal with. You just have to keep track of where everything is, and I did have Ben Hart to help me out a little bit there. I couldn't resist having the big old lug help me out for another fight. But it is possible, and I've only had this happen to me once, there's a very slim chance that Elana will summon pigs to fight you. As I said, it only happened to me one time, and it was incredibly funny when it did, and just because it makes the boss battle so much easier. Regardless of the kind of random summon she can do, I actually really like her design, and I find it to be a challenging but still very enjoyable fight. However, not quite as enjoyable as the next fight we're going to do, where we encounter the dragon of the Sunken Kingdom.
Come back.
Well, visit me.
I'll be around.